The first stop on the virtual brain tour takes a look at the four main parts of the brain: brainstem, the cerebellum, the cortex, and the limbic brain. The first part of the brain to evolve about 500 million years ago was the brainstem. It is also known as the reptilian brain or lower brain. It is located deep down in the brain and extends up from the spinal cord. It is the vehicle for sensory information and is also responsible for many basic functions including heart rate, breathing, sleeping, and eating. The cerebellum evolved about 400 million years ago and is also known as the hindbrain. It is attached to the back of the brainstem. Its main function is to control body position, poise, and balance. It also stores memories for basic learned responses and sends vital information to the brain via the brainstem. The limbic brain was the third part of the brain to evolve between 300 and 200 million years ago and is sometimes called the midbrain. It is located below the cortex, in front of the cerebellum and above the brainstem. It is the most chemically active part of the brain. The limbic brain is the seat of our emotions, and it also maintains blood pressure, heart rate, body temperature, and blood sugar levels. It is also critical to learning and for short and long-term memory. The limbic system consists of several important brain structures, including the thalamus. The main function of the thalamus is to relay motor and sensory signals to the cortex. It is also responsible for the regulation of consciousness and sleep. The hypothalamus is an important part of the limbic brain. It decides which information coming into the brain gets your attention. It also regulates hormones, sexual desire, emotions, eating, drinking, body temperature, chemical balances, sleeping, and waking. It also controls the pituitary gland. Shaped like a seahorse, the hippocampus is involved in the storage of long-term memory and spatial navigation. It is also thought to be involved in Alzheimer's and severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia and severe depression. The amygdala is an almond-shaped set of brain cells located deep within the temporal lobe of the brain. It is involved in many of our emotions like fear, anger, pleasure, and survival instincts. It also decides which memories are stored and where they are stored in the brain. The final part of the brain to evolve was the cerebral cortex, also called the upper brain. The cortex evolved about 200 million years ago. It makes up about 80% of the brain and is split into 4 lobes. Each lobe is responsible for performing its own specific functions. The parietal lobe deals primarily with functions connected with movement, orientation, calculation, and recognition. The occipital lobe is mainly made up of visual processing areas. The temporal lobes deal with sound, speech comprehension, and some aspects of memory. The frontal lobes deal with thinking, planning, and conceptualizing. They also play a major part in the conscious appreciation of emotion. The brain is divided into 2 hemispheres. The left hemisphere is the logical part of the brain and is responsible for words, logic, numbers, analysis, lists, linearity, and sequence. It controls the right side of your body. The right hemisphere is the creative part of the brain and is responsible for rhythm, spatial awareness, colour, imagination, daydreaming, holistic awareness, and dimension. It controls the left side of your body. The hemispheres are separated by a thick band of nerve fibres called the corpus callosum. This connects the brain cells in one hemisphere to those in the other hemisphere, and the 2 hemispheres keep up a continuous conversation via this neural bridge. If you zoom in close enough on a section of your brain, you would see a dense network of cells. The cells that create brain activity are called neurons or brain cells. Neurons are the building blocks of the brain. A piece of brain the size of a pinhead contains approximately 60,000 neurons, and each neuron is able to connect with up to 100,000 other brain cells. Each brain cell has a cell body, which houses the nucleus and cytoplasm. Projecting from the cell body are long root-like fibres called axons and dendrites. Each neuron has several dendrites, which protrude from the cell body. They carry nerve impulses towards the cell body. Each neuron also has one axon. The axon is a thin cylinder which carries electrical impulses away from the cell body towards other neurons. The axon is covered in a white fatty substance called the myelin sheath. The myelin is produced by Schwann's cells. The myelin sheath insulates and protects the axon and speeds up the transmission of the electrical impulse down the axon towards the axon terminals. There are small gaps in the myelin sheath called nodes of Ranvier, which force the electrical impulse to jump across the gaps, thereby speeding up the impulse. At the end of the axon are terminal buttons, which communicate with the next neuron by firing neurotransmitters across the synaptic gap. Neurons are categorized by their function, and there are three main types. Sensory neurons carry information from the sense organs to the central nervous system. Motor neurons carry information to muscles and glands. Relay neurons enable communication between sensory and motor neurons and the central nervous system. These constitute about 97% of the total number of neurons in the central nervous system. Brain cells communicate with each other through an electrochemical process. Every time you think, learn, or communicate, a neuron in your brain sends a nerve impulse down its axon. When the nerve impulse surges down the axon, it is fired across the synaptic gap via a chemical messenger called a neurotransmitter into the dendrite of the receiving brain cell. The nerve impulse then travels along the axon of this brain cell, across the synaptic gap to another brain cell, and so on. When a neuron activates another in this way, it's like a switch being turned on. This activity is the process that creates the intricate pathway of thought, also called memory traces or neural pathways. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers which transmit the nerve impulse across the synaptic gap. Neurons can either excite other neurons to make them function by releasing excitatory neurotransmitters like dopamine, or they can inhibit other neurons so they don't become active by releasing inhibitory neurotransmitters like serotonin. Each individual neuron can create thousands of connections with other neurons throughout the brain. Functionally related brain cells connect to each other to form neural networks, and the more signals sent between two neurons, the stronger the connection grows. The process of having a thought results from the firing of a neural network. The more we think the same thought, the network responsible for that thought becomes stronger, making it more likely to fire again in the future. This is how a habit is formed, by the constant triggering of a specific pathway in the brain, which strengthens the connections and results in the behavior being repeated. It's rather like walking through a dense forest. The first time you walk through, it's quite difficult because there's no pathway to walk along. However, next time you walk through, there is a faint pathway to follow, so it's slightly easier. And if you take the same path many times, it becomes well-trodden and an easy walk. Think of a time when you wanted to learn something new. For example, riding a bicycle. The first time you tried, you had to think really hard about what you were doing. That's because there was no neural network associated with riding a bicycle in your brain at that point. However, the second time you tried to ride the bike, your brain fired the faint riding a bicycle network again, and it was a little bit easier to ride. And with lots of practice, the network became stronger and hardwired into your brain until you reached the point when riding the bike was not only easy, but you also didn't have to consciously think about it. Most of our thoughts are hardwired in the brain in the form of cognitive patterns, which are triggered quickly and easily when required. However, when we want to have new thoughts and ideas, we need to create new neural pathways by forcing our neurons to make new associations and connections. Scientists have been studying the process of creativity for many years and have made many fascinating discoveries into how and where in the brain creative ideas happen. Research shows that a small area of our brain in the right hemisphere, called the anterior superior temporal gyrus, is where the creative spark happens. High-energy brainwaves erupt from this region at the moment of insight, and a new idea flashes into our conscious awareness. Researchers have also discovered that there is a subtle difference in how the neurons are structured in the left versus the right hemispheres. In the right side of our brain, most of the neurons have longer dendrites than those in the left side, which means that they can branch out much further to collide with more distant neurons to make novel connections. There are several ways that we can facilitate this process, including having new and unexpected experiences to disrupt old cognitive patterns, mind wandering to slow down our brainwaves in order to allow new ideas to flow into our conscious minds, and using practical creative thinking tools to stimulate the brain into making new associations and connections. And as we continue to explore the frontiers of science, scientists will be able to reveal new and amazing discoveries about the brain and how we think. It might have evolved many millions of years ago, but we still have much more to learn about this fascinating organ inside our heads.